Hi, everyone, and welcome to Kelp Farming Promises, Pitfalls, and What We Still Don't Know. My name is Vanessa Martone, and I'm an editor at Hackeye Magazine based in Victoria, British Columbia. Today, I'm speaking to you from the territories of the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Pisanik nations. And given the topic of this event, I just want to take a minute to recognize that Indigenous peoples have long histories of harvesting and cultivating seaweeds all along the coast of what's now known as North America. Kelp aquaculture is by no means a new concept. At Hackeye Magazine, we exclusively cover stories about the world's oceans and coastlines. And in mid-March, we published Banking on the Seaweed Rush, a story by Nicola Jones, which has now become our third most read story of all time. Kelp farming is definitely having a moment. We decided to team up with our colleagues at the Ocean Decade Collaborative Center for the Northeast Pacific to delve into the state of the knowledge about how kelp farming affects ecosystems and communities. Now, before we start the panel, I want to get a sense of who's here today. And so we've got two quick polls for you. The first question here is, what best describes your identity or role as it relates to kelp farming? And we've got a few options here for you to choose from. And the second question is, what is the most pressing interest for you, your nation, or your organization when it comes to kelp aquaculture? So I'll just give all of you a minute to answer those. And in the meantime, I'm going to go over a few quick housekeeping items. So today we're going to start with a half-hour panel, followed by 15 minutes for audience questions. Please put your questions in the chat, which you can access via the button at the bottom of the Zoom window. And we'd been hoping to invite audience members to speak during the Q&A today, but with so many of you here, it's not feasible. So my colleague Serena and I are going to be monitoring the chat and pulling out your questions for our host to pose to the panelists. And lastly, if you're a student or you self-identify as being early in your ocean career, regardless of age, industry, or background, please stick around after the Q&A. The panelists have kindly agreed to stay for a separate 30-minute discussion with early career attendees. So that's going to happen in a separate Zoom meeting, and we'll drop the URL for that event in the chat at the very end. So just going back to the polls here, it's great to see that we have a lot of academics and researchers in the audience, also interested members of the public. And when it comes to the most pressing interests for you, there's a lot of people here who are interested in the effects on marine species and ecosystems and the benefits or potential benefits for carbon sequestration. So we've got a lot of expertise in the room today, and I want to encourage everyone to use the chat to share resources and really build on the discussion that's happening during the panel. Finally, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Rebecca Martone. Rebecca is the Executive Director of the Tula Foundation's Ocean Decade Collaborative Center for the Northeast Pacific and has been working to inform management of nearshore marine ecosystems, including kelp forests, for 20 years. Take it away, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. I'm so grateful and excited to be here with you all today. As Vanessa said, the Ocean Decade Collaborative Center for the Northeast Pacific is a division of the Tula Foundation. We're an endorsed contribution to the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. Our aim is to support and facilitate collaborative, co-designed, and co-produced knowledge for solutions to the ocean challenges in the Northeast Pacific region, which spans from Alaska down to Baja California and out to Hawaii. The dialogue we're hosting today supports the Ocean Decade challenges around blue foods and food security, as well as ocean climate solutions, ecosystem restoration and recovery. On behalf of the team here at the Decade Collaborative Center, I want to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of all of the Indigenous peoples that have called the Northeast Pacific region home since time immemorial, from the coast to the deep water and across boundaries and borders. The Collaborative Center deeply values equity, justice, and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and we strive for inclusion of diverse voices in the work we support. So with that, I'd like to welcome the following speakers to our expert panel. We're so thrilled to have you all here. First, I'll welcome Dr. Jennifer Clark. Jennifer is a phycologist and chief science officer at Cascadia Seaweed, which is the largest kelp cultivator in Canada. There, she oversees research and development on seaweed cultivation and ecosystem services, as well as the production of kelp in 7 ocean farms for agricultural purposes. So welcome, Jen. Next, I'd like to welcome Dune Lankard. Dune is an Eyak Athabascan fisher, an activist, and founding president of Native Conservancy, a nonprofit organization that empowers Alaska Native peoples to preserve endangered habitats and cultural lifeways on their ancestral homelands through initiatives such as kelp farming. Welcome, Dune. Finally, I'd like to invite Dr. Nicole Price to join us. Welcome, Nicole. Nicole is a marine ecologist at Bigelow Laboratory for Ocean Sciences in Maine in the United States, where she studies the ecophysiology of seaweeds, how they cycle carbon and nutrients in the ocean, and their potential role in mitigating coastal ocean acidification and climate change. So welcome, everyone. We're thrilled to have you. We're going to start the dialogue today with a few questions. So first, I'd like to highlight some of the key aspects of kelp cultivation. As many of you all know that are in the audience, there are 3 different groups of seaweed. There are red seaweeds, green seaweeds, and brown seaweeds that are named for the color of the pigments they use to photosynthesize. In some regions of the world, primarily Asia, there is a long history of seaweed farming, mostly of red algae, that are used for things like food, as well as additives in various products such as cosmetics and ice cream, I think sunscreen, other things. And now markets are beginning to expand, and seaweed production is taking off around the globe, including Europe, Africa, and in North America, including here in our region in the Northeast Pacific. So in this conversation today, we're really focusing on kelps, which are a group of large brown seaweeds. And Cascadia Seaweed, as the largest kelp cultivator in Canada, is doing a lot of this work. So Jen, can you start us off by describing a typical Cascadia kelp operation?
Yeah, sure. So thank you so much for having me here today. I'm hailing from Sydney in the traditional and unceded territories of the Wasanich people. So Cascadia Seaweed has 8 farms around Vancouver Island and around 24 hectares in total, with some of our biggest farms being about 6 hectares and our smallest farms being about 1 to 2 hectares. We primarily, we cultivate 3 different types of seaweeds, Alaria marginata, Saccharina latissima, and Macrocystis perifera. And we estimate anywhere between 100 to 200 tons of wet weight that this will provide. Our uses primarily for our seaweeds is in the agricultural sector. So we are making products for cow feed, so a feed supplement, and also biostimulants. And a biostimulant is a little bit different to fertilizers, in which they actually nourish the soil through providing a safety for the microbial network in the soil. Cultivation happens in a nursery, and most farms will have a nursery, or at least know someone who is growing seaweed in a nursery. It takes about 6 weeks to produce spools, and here's just an example of a very small spool of what our seed actually grows on. So the seed will attach onto these spools. They spend about 6 weeks in the nursery until they're big enough. And then we take them to the ocean farms, and we have production lines. It's just an example, which we put into the spools and unwrap the actual seed line around the production line. So that's typically how seeded farms get seeded, from the nursery all the way out to the ocean. They spend about 4 to 6 months, depending where you are, in the water, to where they will grow until April and May, to big, healthy looking seaweeds in which we harvest. So we're actually now in the middle of harvesting now. So it's very exciting times.
Well, great. We're so thrilled that you're here and joining us, given your busy schedule. Maybe turning to Dune, Alaska Native communities have used kelp for food and cultural purposes that stretch over millennia. You've had those traditional relationships, but what roles do or could kelp farming play in local food security and cultural revitalization today? And again, if you have other thoughts about your own kelp farms that you want to add to what Jen has just mentioned too, please include that as well.
Sure. Well, I'm excited to be here with you all today. I've been traveling and quite busy here, which, I thought going from commercial fishing to kelp farming, that things would slow down because I don't have to chase that food source around in the ocean. And I don't have to feed it or water it or give it fertilizer. And somehow I'd get paid to watch kelp grow, but that hasn't been the case at all. It's been go, 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 nonstop. I've had 70-hour weeks for 3.5 years now, but I enjoy it. In 2017, our Copper River fisheries kind of plummeted. Usually we'd harvest 1.5 million to 2 million sockeyes annually from the Copper River Delta. And in 2017, we only had a harvest of 45,000. The following year, 90,000 sockeye salmon. The following year, the ocean heated up to 76 degrees for 3 weeks down to 20 feet below the surface. And I sat down with my family and friends and said, we're going to have to pivot. And this is what climate change is like and going to be like. And so we have to figure out how to create blue-green jobs that are going to build economies that are based on restoration and regeneration. And that was tough to, leave something that I've been doing since I was 5 years old and reinvent myself as a kelp farmer. But I started reading about kelp and talking to a number of people. My sister Pamela found this article from the Cordova Times in 1908, where this reporter had seen these two EAC gals get off of the Bering River ship that had come in from the Bering River that's about 100 miles east of Cordova, where I live on the Gulf of Alaska. And he saw them skipping down the road, and it looked like a brick of coal from the Bering River coal field underneath their arm. And there was a big battle that had happened and ensued for about 12 years over opening the Bering River coal field to the Alaska Syndicate so they could power their locomotives to go 150 miles upriver and take the copper ore out of Kennecott and bring him down to Cordova. So he thought that these two Native women had a brick of coal underneath their arm. And when he caught up to them, they actually had a brick of kelp. And the EACs were famous for rendering the hooligan oil and using it for fires and cooking and butter and lights. And we traded that 300 miles up the Copper River and 300 miles across the Copper River Delta. Well, this kelp cake, imagine a layer of kelp, layer hooligan oil, layer of berries, more kelp, just stacked and then cold pressed. It was probably one of America's first energy bars. And so when you would go on long trips, you would take one of those with you because it would keep you alive if you couldn't catch any other fish or any other animal. And so there's even stories of the early military expeditions to Alaska and scientific expeditions where when the people didn't realize how to feed themselves or were getting scurvy and dying as their boats crashed and went dry on shore at low water, they saw this kelp and they ate it and they survived. And so it gave them the strength to rebound and figure out how to finish their report. So historically, indigenous peoples for thousands of years have harvested and enjoyed kelp. There's a wonderful report that this Tlingit elder, Dolly Garza, wrote about Alaska kelp, which as soon as I read that, I knew that I was on the right track. And the last thing I'd like to say in this opening is that my first income from the sea was when I was 12 years old, and we were grappling using hooks, throwing it in the water and ripping the kelp out of the bottom and taking the herring roe on kelp and selling it to the Japanese for $4 a pound. So at 12 years old was my first $4,000 made from kelping out in Prince William Sound. And so now, ironically, I find myself at 64 this summer. One of my last incomes from the sea will be from kelp.
That's really so fascinating, Dan. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I will definitely return to you and dig into that some more, but maybe just building on what you were talking about with the Copper River salmon and the threat of climate change, which is clearly something that is continuing to be an impact in our region and around the world. You know, we hear a lot about how seaweed aquaculture can aid in climate mitigation and carbon sequestration as a potential solution, in addition to the benefits it supplies in terms of food and stimulating local economies and potentially, you know, other markets. And we can talk some more about that. But I want to ask maybe Nicole, given your perspective and your expertise, what does research say about how kelp farms might counteract climate change? And then, you know, what are some of the biggest knowledge gaps that we're still trying to fill in that space?
Yeah, thank you for the question, and thank you for inviting me today. So I'm zooming in from East Booth Bay, Maine, which is located about an hour north of Portland, and that's where Bigelow Laboratory for Ocean Sciences is located on Wabanaki territory. So I'd like to recognize them as well. And we've been doing some research on kelp aquaculture at Bigelow since about 2014 now. And the research started in terms of climate mitigation, looking at the ability for farmed kelp to take up or absorb carbon dioxide and locally remediate or mitigate the effect of ocean acidification around the area where the farm is being grown, particularly with the hope that the possibility of co-culturing kelp along with other shellfish species would relieve those shellfish species from the stress caused by ocean acidification in terms of calcifying and growing those shells. And we've had some exciting results looking at farming kelp and mussels together. But pretty quickly that turned into questions about what's happening to that CO2 that the kelp is absorbing, where does it go, and what does that mean for global warming and potentially mitigating at a larger global scale the problem of climate change. And so not too long ago, we teamed up with a group called Oceans 2050, which is led by Carlos Duarte, to do some research on a global scale, looking at 22 farms across the world and taking sediment cores from beneath those farms to understand what the deposition rate of detritus or flaked off bits of seaweed might be to the sediments below the farms, with the hope or the supposition that once that seaweed falls down to the sediment, becomes incorporated in the sediment, it might be trapped there and thus permanently removed from the global carbon cycle, or at least removed for long enough periods that you could count it as carbon sequestration. So we've been measuring uptake rates, now we're measuring deposition rates and hope to get some evidence of longevity or permanence of that deposition. And I'll put the link in the chat after I'm done discussing, but we have a preprint article that's available now online, and it's been submitted for a peer review process that shows that there is evidence of potential carbon deposition and sequestration then underneath certain kelp farms. But as is with anything, the certainty of whether or not that carbon is getting sequestered definitely depends on lots of factors like the size and the age of the farm, how much kelp is being grown there, whether or not the sort of exposure or circulation patterns around that farm end up removing the fixed CO2 in tissues and placing it elsewhere or storing it right there. So we are just really scratching the surface of being able to understand what sorts of carbon sequestration processes can happen just from a natural kelp farm growing cycle. Then there are additional questions to be asked about whether or not one would want to sink the entire crop of seaweed purposefully, trying to target the deposition of the entire farm as a carbon sink process. I personally like to think a little bit more critically about the kelp product and how it might have lots of value to the farmer in various markets that also can contribute to climate mitigation. For instance, as Jen mentioned earlier, feeding the seaweed to livestock, particularly ruminants like cows for dairy or beef systems, and suppress the methane burps or the enteric methane that's generated from those animals just as a normal part of their digestion process. There's also ways to think about the kelp as a biofuel, or again, as Jen mentioned, the biostimulants can also act to sort of spur on the carbon sequestration potential of the soils in those ag systems as well. And then there's a lot of interesting research that's starting looking at bioplastics made from kelps and building materials made from kelps that also have a longevity to them that could contribute to carbon sequestration. So in the end, what is really needed, a major gap, is some very robust life cycle assessments that compare the various pathways for the kelp product and how it's best used to help address climate change scenarios. So I'll leave it there for now, but I hope we get more questions.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Nicole. It's really thorough. And I think it's important, and I appreciate that you sharing that there is still a lot of work to do in that space, both, for the idea of kelp as a sink, or how you actually create a circular economy that could still help with carbon sequestration. But again, there's these huge gaps. Maybe shifting a little bit into how kelp, while it may have these questions around carbon sequestration, there's also, discussion about how kelp provides other ecosystem services, such as absorbing excess nutrients from seawater, acting as fish habitat, but also they can have negative ecosystem effects. And so this idea that there are definitely impacts in everything that humans do, but understanding that, such as reducing phytoplankton growth by shading the water column potentially, especially at these larger scales, potentially entangling whales in floating lines. Again, this idea that there are going to be different types of impacts with different types of farms in different places, such as offshore and nearshore. So maybe turning to Jen, in your arena, what do we know about how seaweed aquaculture affects the local ecosystem, and what still remains to be resolved or identified? And again, I would also encourage both Dune and Nicole, please feel free also to jump in, or if you have a comment, give me a nod after Jennifer responds. Thanks.
Yeah, so we know that kelp can do all these fantastic things, carbon capture and nutrient uptake as a part of their kind of basic metabolic activities. They're photosynthesizing, they are uptaking and storing carbon, and then they're also uptaking nutrients. And I know that's like everybody wants kelp to be this silver bullet that's going to feed the world and solve climate change. But there's definitely things that kelp aquaculture can do. Part of that being, as Nicole said, being a part of the carbon cycle. We still don't know a lot. We still need to learn a little bit more about that permanent carbon sequestration. But nutrient uptake for sure, although we probably can't uptake everything that we want to take out of the oceans, it can definitely help kind of reduce some of those nutrients, perhaps in runoff or from point sources. You would need quite a lot of kelp to do that. And I'm not sure if the kelp aquaculture sector right now is in that position to produce that much kelp to reduce that nutrients. But, it does provide a temporary habitat for some of our migrating fish. We actually have a researcher, Dr. Colin Bates, who is doing work as a part of the British Columbian Salmon Restoration Innovation Foundation. And he is looking at kelp farms as being a potential place for refuge for migrating salmon and the forage fish that may inhabit it. And, he's put these kelp cams out and has taken measurements and scuba surveys. And we are seeing use of the kelp farms for temporary habitat, whether that's for food or for shelter, just a place to kind of hide from predators. And, this is a temporary habitat for sure, at least while the kelp is in. But even with the kelp out, some of those, the lines that are kept in as well, they sometimes provide just a little bit of shelter and food for passing fish. So those data are really informative to really see whether kelp farms can provide at least a temporary shelter for fisheries and other forage fish. The wild kelp biodiversity. So we know that wild kelp stands provide, a 3D structure. They've got stipes and holdfasts that create this ecosystem that potentially kelp farms can't mimic, but they can potentially provide that temporary relief from going from forest to forest. And the effects of the wild kelp genetics, we actually are very conservative on producing our seed for farms. So every year we take individuals from the farm, around 50 kilometers from around the farm. Our parent material is sourced, and we mix many individuals to create, more than 900 genotypes that potentially can intermix with whatever is already there at the time. We do take all of our kelp out of the water before they become reproductive, but if they do become reproductive, they're kind of already mixing in with the genes that are already there. We are also collecting conservatively. So we only take the reproductive part of the seaweed, of the kelp. And in fact, last year, one of our divers was able to get seed again from the same individual that was cut. So we know we are being conservative. And so there, of course, with any kind of farm, with any kind of there are some risks, and we are in the Pacific Northwest kind of navigating those risks at the same time. But I know from Cascadia, we are taking a very conservative approach to it. Things like light shading. Our kelps are in the water from October to April in the middle of winter. So a lot of the seaweeds that are kind of already growing are in that dark period as well. And any kind of invasive species, we don't actually move any of our seaweeds at all. So there's no risk from moving one population or one farm to another place, because that never happens in this industry. So we're definitely navigating these risks as they come. And actually, for the phytoplankton bloom, I read a great article about how kelps can actually help with reducing harmful algal blooms, because they're reducing the nutrients available for those harmful algal blooms. So there's definitely some positive and negatives for kelp farms, and I think there's a really great story to be told about how we can provide food and products that are helpful for agriculture, do something about climate change, and provide those ecosystem services. And as well as the economic opportunity, providing jobs for many people up and down the coast.
Thanks, Jen. I saw that Dune maybe wanted to make a comment, and then Nicole, and then we'll turn to another question. Dune?
Yeah. When I think about, the restoration and healing that has to happen for the ocean, I can look back to the Exxon Valdez oil spill, where in Prince William Sound, prior to the spill, we had 200,000 tons of Pacific herring returning to the Sound annually. Then the herring fishery literally crashed, and we have had maybe 2 fisheries over the last 33 years, because the number plummeted down to about 4,000 tons returning, and the herring were actually bleeding underneath their scales and not reproducing. And the last 2 years, we've had 20,000 tons returning, but spawning on the Copper River Delta and not in Prince William Sound. And so what we're hoping is that the herring will spawn on our kelp farms, because the native peoples are interested primarily in healing the ocean, the restoration first, feeding their people a traditional food source second, and being part of a regenerative economy last. But, there was a big kelp farm that was put together, and set out in Southeast Alaska. And when the herring came back, they decided to spawn on that kelp farm. And the owner was pretty upset, and we are all cheering and happy, because I've always believed that the herring are smarter than us humans. And if they'll spawn in cleaner, cooler waters offshore, that they won't be getting this disease from this oil that is still coming off of the beaches. Because there's a lot of areas in Prince William Sound that are still dead zones 33 years later. So we wanted the Exxon Valdez Oil Spill Trustee Council in the last act of restoration for the spill zone to help us get kelp and mariculture farms in the water to do the best we can to heal and feed our people at the same time.
That's really interesting. And, an unintended consequence, perhaps good for the herring and harder for the farmer to figure out how to address. But that's really, I think a critically important consideration. Dune, thank you. Nicole, did you have a comment?
Yeah, just a couple of short ones. And in response to some of the questions, there's so many good questions in the chat. I really appreciate it. One comment is there's some really interesting research happening at UNH on breakaway lines for seaweed farms to address the concerns or issues about possible marine mammal entanglement issues, or any marine wildlife entanglement issues. There's another really good question about, do we know what the impacts are for dumping large amounts of seaweed on the seafloor? And the truth is no, we have no idea. So there's definitely a major research gap there. And that's a concern about using seaweed in large amounts for carbon sequestration, the unintended consequences of sinking large amounts of seaweed. There are small experiments that are starting to happen at Bigelow, and I'm aware of some happening elsewhere in the world to try to fill those knowledge gaps. And I hope to keep people informed as we go along. And then there was a really good question about the safety of seaweed that's getting grown in the ocean. It is a very good sponge for carbon dioxide, but also lots of other naturally occurring heavy metals in the ocean environment. And I just wanted to make everyone aware of an ongoing program by the National Institute of Science and Technology to standardize testing protocols for seaweed tissues for some of these safety concerns, because it's not only potentially a problem depending on where the seaweed's grown, but there's an additional problem that labs aren't currently reporting the exact same numbers for the exact same sample. And that makes it really difficult to follow how safe the seaweed is to consume. So those results should be coming out in the next year or so. That was funded by the World Wildlife Fund and
NIST. So that's in the United States, but it's good. So it's national guidelines for the US, but that's useful information for other countries that are looking to have standards as well, or is it a global?
It was global in scale for invitations for labs that wanted to participate in the event.
Great. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Well, I'm great that you were able to answer some questions from the audience too. We'll be turning to audience questions soon, but before we do that, I want to go back to Dune. And Dune, we have talked about these benefits that kelp provides. As you said, some of these things that the communities are interested in is certainly ocean health, but also, traditional food harvesting and then ultimately potentially economic value and jobs. And so I wonder, what do you think, or how do you feel about communities as they're going through this process? What do they need to know to make informed decisions about, whether or not to dive in? Are there some considerations for, Indigenous sovereignty in this space, ensuring social justice? And if you have some thoughts about, what do you feel that Indigenous communities should know about as they get, start thinking about how to dive into the kelp farming industry?
Yeah, that's a good question, and kind of how I start out with different tribes that we work with across the state is I go into a little meditation. I said, oh, okay, now imagine you're sitting in front of your bay window and you're feeling really good about life. It's early in the morning and you're drinking your sovereign cup of coffee and feeling good about things. And all of a sudden a boat comes rolling in the bay and starts deploying anchors, lines, and buoys, and it's not you. And that permit is good for 10 years. And it can be renewed for another 10 after 10. Now how do you feel? And, they immediately, oh my God, we need to be permitting. And unlike fishing that starts in May and ends in end of September, kelping starts in end of September and ends in May. So in order to do this kelp farming and monitoring, you're going to have to be out in the coldest, darkest, stormiest parts of the year. So you're going to want to permit close to home. You're not going to want to have to travel 4 or 5 miles, or 4 or 5 hours across the sound to attend your farm. So what we're witnessing is an actual modern day land claims on the ocean. And it's about ocean rights, it's about water rights, and it's about self-determination and sovereignty. So I feel that Indigenous peoples should organize. And we started a Kelp Now listening tour so we could hear the fears and concerns of Indigenous peoples across the state. And it was resounding. They were concerned about mariculture coming to a shoreline near them soon. I also think that if we're going to have any chance of having sustainability in this new ocean industry, we actually have to get involved with the Coastal Seaweed Farm Act. That we need to look at the laws, look at the legislation, look at the policies, and a lot of them are wrong. A lot of them need attention and some work. So we're going to start a native kelp cooperative so we can figure out how to offset the overhead expenses and get into processing and do a number of things because you have all these detriments and barriers to entry. And I call it the big 5, which is marketing, processing, dehydration, transportation to market, and renewables. And so we, along with the Kelp Cooperative, we want to start a Native Kelp Alliance, a 501c4, to address those laws and policies. And then we are also looking at a kelpnation.org, how do we unite and duplicate the successes rather than the many mistakes that we'll make in this industry? Because anything that we can do to figure out how to de-risk this major investment that's unproven, we're really going to have to, sharpen our pencil and sit down and figure this out. Because some of the biggest things that we're facing right now is funding to help get this started and to begin social impact money, as well as foundation and private donor money, is what's going to help get this off the ground. Permitting is a huge expense. Figuring out where you're going to source your seed. The processing is one of the biggest detriments to getting to market. And, and I just feel like, we're all wise enough and smart enough that if we collectively put our minds together, we can figure out answers and solutions that we can help each other. Because I'm not worried about the bigs, the processors, the canneries, or the big kelp corporations, or even the fishermen for that matter. They're going to get their share. But I can tell you right now, the Indigenous peoples are not. And so that's why I'm helping organize them to the best of my ability to give them the opportunity to be a part of this quickly, rapidly growing industry.
That's really great, Dune. Thank you. I really appreciate your emphasis there. And maybe just turning to Jen and Cascadia's approach to things, just because, I think this is a huge challenge that communities are going to face, this rapid expansion of an industry that they may not get benefits from, but would feel the impacts from. So how do we actually, as you say, Dune, create solutions in this space and get on it quickly, because it's coming, whether, kelp is having a moment, as Vanessa said.
Yeah, absolutely. So Cascadia actually works with all of our Indigenous people as a part of we partnership with many Indigenous people, many First Nations. We actually partner with 7. And there many of the nations that we do partner with actually approach us. So at least in the BC coast, that's what we have. I'm not sure what it's like in Alaska, but there's definitely interest for for having kelp aquaculture in some of these areas. And as partners, we work together, making sure that they're involved with many of the processes that happen with acquiring a tenure or a part of the land, or a part of the ocean, sorry. So the licenses are actually owned by the First Nations, and we actually lease the area from them. And we employ and use boats as much as possible from our First Nation partners. So we are involved, we are partnerships, highly involved in Cascadia seaweed. So I really hope that that's kind of like what we're going with forward, including coasts and First Nations in all aspects of kelp farming.
Very well, I'm just seeing the time. We maybe want to take a question from the audience, and then we can circle back on this. Oh, Nicole, did you have a comment? I'm sorry.
Yeah, just a quick comment. I really wanted to echo Dune's and congratulate Dune's objective of uniting groups to come forward and organize around these concerns. I would caution something that's been happening on the East Coast and in Maine in particular. In this state, we have at least 3 groups that are trying to represent the seaweed industry in Maine. We have the Maine Seaweed Council, we have a Seaweed Fisheries Advisory Council, and we also have a Maine Aquaculture Association. And as these groups bubble up, it's difficult to constantly seek alignment with goals across them. So that's a challenge that the Northeast has faced, but it's an opportunity to learn from what's working over here and what isn't. And then I would say that the co-op model that you're proposing is one that is really gaining traction on this coast. There are at least 4 co-ops models that are working in the Northeast that are becoming lucrative in some way or another for the members of those co-ops.
Thanks, Nicole. And yeah, it's really helpful to have your perspective, given that Maine has probably had the longest running, kelp aquaculture in North America. It might be interesting to hear some more thoughts from you on that. But maybe first we'll start with a question around there's one that's maybe to you, Jen. There seem to be guides for sustainable development of kelp farming coming from the US and Europe, but are there any in Canada, or can we look to these international guidelines, and do we need to be pushing for more of these from a Canadian perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So right now there isn't very many regulations for kelp aquaculture, and in fact, I believe we're still under the shellfish aquaculture regulations, and so we are being very cautious as we kind of continue with producing kelp without heavily, a lot of regulations in BC. And we have actually taken from Alaska, for instance, being conservative and only taking parent stock from 50 kilometers around our farms. So we're trying to navigate how to be sustainable and very environmentally conscious about how we can grow kelp in the ocean, and and without regulations in BC. So yeah, we're taking a cautious approach for sure.
Yeah, maybe going back to what Dune had said about, this importance of being involved in legislation for community, and too, maybe Dune, I don't know if you have a thought or a perspective on that.
Yeah, it's I can only go back in my history and like what happened with limited entry in 1973. Okay, they turned our finfish, our salmon, into a commodity, and all of a sudden there was limited entry and number of permits that were for sale. In Alaska, you can only fill each bay with 30% mariculture. And so real soon here, it's going to go towards limited entry. And so your $10,000 to $15,000 permit that, by the time you figure out how to do your landscape analysis, write your business plan, write your application, figure out how you're going to get workman's comp, your insurance, and form your LLC, you're going to be $10,000 to $15,000 invested. And that's without even getting your farm gear, right? Your anchors, lines, and buoys. Well, if it goes to limited entry, depending on what we get per pound, I'm pushing for $1 a pound for as hard of work as this is, and that's just for raw wet kelp just pulled out of the sea, where if the value of that permit could go up to $300,000 to $400,000 each. And so what I'm hoping is that the indigenous peoples are going to organize and figure out how to get CDQs for mariculture rather than individual owned farms. And what I mean by CDQs is community development quotas that are owned by the tribe. So when you're building this regenerative industry, that if a farmer wants to step down, another one can step up, and you don't lose that restorative or regenerative economy that is only one of 1,000 blue-green jobs that actually needs to be funded and implemented if we're going to survive as a human race. So I feel like, as much as we can gather in historical, history that has shown how to do things wrong, because we have the ability, we have this opportunity right now to do something good for the ocean, but Alaska needs a plan, America needs a plan, the world needs a plan, and I don't see that happening quick enough, and that's why I was really happy to see our Congresswoman Mary Peltola jump on with Jared Huffman and Ed Markey to roll out the Coastal Seaweed Act. And so it's at least a starting point on how we can get some sort of plan in place that's going to work for the environment, for the ocean, for all the critters that depend on wild kelp forests, and then us humans. I feel that we can balance this if we just put our minds to work and figure out how to do it.
That's great optimism. It's wonderful. I think the other thing, if you have CDQ examples for mariculture, I don't know if there are any, but if anybody does have any, if you could drop those into the chat, or I know there's small scale fisheries cooperatives in Mexico that also exist, not around kelp farms, but there are examples in the world. So Dune, if you have some, can you share that?
Like we have CDQs for the bottom of the ocean in the northwestern part of the state. So all the communities north of the Aleutian chain have community development quotas for the bottom fish. And what originally, when Stevens created that program, Senator Stevens, he thought that he'd throw the natives a bone and it'd bring $20 million a year in income to the communities that needed it. Well, it's about 200 million a year in revenues that's helping all of these villages flourish and build community cold storage, community food centers, that are actually helping feed their people. But I feel like we need to go one step further. We need to figure out how to do community development quotas for the surface of the ocean, because of this land claims mentality that is happening in the industry. And what we're talking about in some of these villages, they're experiencing 85% unemployment. So I feel like this blue-green ocean farming economy has the opportunity to relocalize lost jobs that have been taken by the seafood industry over the last 150 years. So my hope is that indigenous peoples will figure out how to rise up and work together to get something meaningful in place that actually is going to work for their goals of healing the ocean, feeding their people, and building a regenerative economy.
Thanks so much for that. I'm going to shift gears, even though we could have, I think, many, many hours discussion in this place and learn a lot from you, Dune, for sure. Maybe I'll turn to this idea of questions around selective breeding of kelps for heat tolerance. There's been quite a few in the audience. So maybe for Jen or Nicole, how can GMO kelps help the industry and ecosystem? What are the potential consequences to that? Or maybe is there science that even is starting to look into that?
There's a very critical distinction. You just mixed up two terms that need to be separated.
Okay, that's great.
So selective breeding is taking, as Jen was describing, the natural population and just crossing them to see what you end up with and maybe challenge them with a certain growing condition and only take those that have survived. For instance, this is going to probably become quite critical for thermal or temperature tolerance. It's actively happening. Somebody else asked what we can learn from Asian countries. I mean, this is a very big research program in South Korea and a very successful research program to selectively breed more thermally tolerant individuals over there. It's not something that's acceptable to main policymakers as of yet, and I don't know where it stands in Canada, to be honest. But there are two ways to make this a conservative approach. One is to, as Jen described, use very localized populations so that you're not introducing any new genetic material to that population, and two, to either harvest the seaweed before it becomes reproductive or generate through selective breeding non-fertile individuals so that they aren't going to reproduce and put genetic material back into the population. I hope that evidence-based research can drive decisions around whether or not those can be acceptable, because I do see, at least we have another researcher at Bigelow who's looking at populations in southern Maine of native kelp populations, and they are moving forwards, as has been reported on the coast of Australia and elsewhere in the world, sort of running away from those rising temperatures. The other piece that you spoke about, GMO, that's genetically modified organisms. So that's actually getting in there and messing with the genome experimentally and introducing novel pieces of DNA. I don't see an appetite for that yet in ocean aquaculture. Although we should point out that it happens all the time in shellfish aquaculture and in oyster aquaculture, for instance, and it happens quite a lot in land-based ag systems, but I don't see an appetite for it yet in kelp aquaculture.
Thanks. And yeah, thanks for clarifying that and keeping us straight. That's really good. That's why we're so happy to have you here. Dune, did you have a comment on that, or can I switch to another question?
Go ahead.
Okay. I think maybe this idea of, well, maybe I'll start, this might be our last question. So maybe I'll just open it up for all three of you. Like, how would you like to see the industry evolve in North America over the next 5 years? And maybe I'll start with Jen and then go to Nicole, and then we'll end with Dune. Is that okay? So I really appreciate that. And we didn't get a chance to answer all the questions in the audience, so we appreciate everybody being able to participate, and we'll try to do that in the chat later. And I think Vanessa will address that too. So maybe Jen, go ahead with you, and then we'll shift to Nicole.
Yeah, sure. So I hope to see, I think kelp aquaculture can provide a lot of solutions to providing a food system, a nature-based solution, provide jobs, also help the food industry as well by providing better alternatives like a biostimulant or methane reducing products to cows as we continue in the future. I would like to see the kelp aquaculture industry being sustainable, that we can also just rely on, shifting our mentality away from land-based foods and look more into the ocean for some of these solutions. I think when we're thinking about farming, kelp aquaculture provides probably the least amount of risk in terms of not taking any more food or taking any more land, not using fresh waters, and not using any chemicals or fertilizers in that mix. So I think we have a great future in BC, and I just really want to see it flourish and provide some of those solutions that we know kelp can do.
Thanks, Jen. Nicole, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I just hope that there's enough time to educate the broader public about carbon markets and how there are some that have a lot of oversight, a lot of measurement, reporting, and verification procedures to validate whether or not the sequestration process is happening. And as we learn more about kelp farming and its potential for sequestration, that there are methodologies developed specifically for kelp farmers from any sort of type of farm, small farm to big co-ops, to be able to access those carbon credits, but that we don't go too far into the greenwashing sort of territory where there are opportunities to claim carbon offsets and carbon value without any oversight. And I just hope that people can educate themselves as to the difference between those two processes and target those that follow an evidence-based approach for sequestration. That's where I hope we go with carbon sequestration and kelp farming.
Thanks, Nicole. And finally to you, June, if you have a few thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think about my buddy, Dr. Elizabeth Hoover, who wrote this article entitled, "How Can You Call Yourself Sovereign If You Can't Feed Yourself?" And to me, as a fisherman, I've fed millions of people every single year. And that's always been first and foremost on my family and me as a fisherman, to feed people and make sure that, we can feed our community, especially in these times of climate change. But to me, we have to learn how to grow things from the land and the sea if we're going to figure this out, how we're going to survive. And it looks right now, it appears that kelp is the hemp of the sea, that it has all these different magical properties that can do all these things, from the fertilizer to the compost to the pharmaceuticals, the nutraceuticals, the cosmetics, the animal feed. I mean, the list goes on, right? But to me, a lot of kelp farmers, ocean farmers are interested and concerned about that return on investment. I think there's a different kind of ROI that we need to look at, which is the ripples of impact that this industry has on the ocean and the people and the critters. To me, it's about the ocean. It's about healing. It's about restoration. It's about mitigation. It's about conservation. It's about survival as a human race. And so, if people want to call me and talk about carbon credits or carbon offsets, I want to talk about insets. Pay me to sequester carbon. I'm not interested in the trading, and a lot of indigenous peoples aren't either. And so the bottom line is kelp can help. And in the meantime, we just have to do the best we can to be good stewards and guardians of the ocean, like we have for thousands of years. And sometimes that means that we just have to slow down and go back in time and change our relationship with the ocean and change our relationship with our food source and figure out how we're going to do this, because we're running out of time, people.
The good message.
And one last thing
Go ahead.
is that I think we should have a workshop and all of us back together again and have more time to work through some of these things, because I've been looking at some of these chats and it's wonderful. I think these are some of the best questions I've seen in a while, and comments from folks. So thank you for inviting me.
I love this idea, and definitely let's talk about that. We should totally have that next phase. So thank you all. Thanks for ending that, Dune, with that next step. I first just really want to thank you, all you speakers, as well as the audience, for your time and your energy and helping to support the discussion that we've had today. I think it's been really insightful and just really rich and informative. We are, as the Collaborative Center, going to shamelessly promote our next dialogue in this series, which will be around environmental DNA for stewardship and monitoring. But I really like this idea, Dune, of next steps in this space. There's so much more to talk about and much opportunity for collaborative work to inform solutions in this burgeoning field. So thank you. And I will pass it over to Vanessa to close us out.
Thanks for moderating the conversation today, Rebecca. That was fantastic. I also want to thank the panelists and all of you who are participating in the chat. I think this discussion was really rich and informative. Someone described it as drinking from a fire hose, and I think that's a pretty apt description. So watch your inboxes after this event. We'll be sending an email in the coming days with a link to the recording on YouTube, a survey about how the event went, and as many other resources as we can glean on kelp and kelp farming, so that everyone can take advantage of all the info that was zipping around. I also want to remind all the early career ocean professionals and students, so anyone who identifies as being just launching into their future, working in ocean industries. Join the panelists in the session immediately following this one. I've put the link to that Zoom event in the chat. I'll just pop it in there one more time, and that will begin immediately as this event ends. Again, thanks to everyone for joining us today. It was a really inspiring and an exciting discussion. Take care.
All right. Bye, everyone. Let's connect soon.
Thank you.